There is a question that for nearly 2,000 years has remained one of the most acute in the history of human thought. A question that has divided peoples, sparked great debates, and forced millions to reconsider everything they thought about God, sin, and forgiveness. And this question is, why do the Jews, the very people from whose midst Christianity emerged, the very people to whom the entire biblical history was addressed, not accept the sacrifice of Jesus as atonement for their sins? They did not accept it then in the first century. They do not accept it today, and by all appearances, do not intend to accept it in the foreseeable future. What is the reason for this refusal? Stubbornness? Misunderstanding? Historical blindness? Or does something entirely different lie behind it? A profound theological logic rooted in the most ancient layers of the biblical text. It is this question we will unravel today, step by step, layer by layer. Imagine first-century Jerusalem. A massive white stone temple stands atop the mountain, and every day, from dawn to dusk, sacrificial fires burn in the courtyard. The smell of smoke drifts over the city. Priests in white garments perform rituals thousands of years old, and pilgrims from all corners of the land bring animals, oxen, sheep, doves. This is not merely a rite. It is the living heart of the Jewish religion, its visible center, its breath. A few decades pass and all of this disappears. Roman legions enter Jerusalem. The temple is burned to the ground, the altar turned to ash, and the priests scattered across the world. It would seem that for a religion built around this place and these rituals, the end has come. Complete, final, impossible to overcome. But something utterly astonishing occurs. Judaism not only survives, it continues to exist for nearly 2,000 years without a single sacrifice, without the temple, without the altar, and yet without the slightest sense of theological emptiness. Jews pray, observe the commandments, repent of sins, and receive forgiveness, all without that very sacrifice which seemed to be the center of the entire system. How is this possible? This is the first riddle of our investigation. And here appears a second riddle, even more unexpected. At roughly the same time the temple lay in ruins, a new teaching began spreading throughout the Roman Empire, whose followers claimed a sacrifice had indeed been made, one, final, definitive, incomparably more significant than all previous ones. It was not the sacrifice of an animal, but of a man, Jesus of Nazareth. And this sacrifice, in their conviction, once and for all atoned for the sins of all humanity. It would seem here is a ready answer to the tragedy of the destroyed temple. Animal sacrifices are no longer needed, precisely because an incomparably higher sacrifice has been offered. But the Jews, the very people from whose midst this teaching emerged, the very people to whom all the prophecies of salvation were addressed, rejected this answer completely and categorically, and continue to reject it to this day. Why? This is not merely a question of religious disagreement, though the disagreement here is, of course, immense. It is one of the deepest theological disputes in human history, the dispute that divided one people, reading the same sacred texts, into two traditions that arrived at entirely different conclusions. In this video, we will examine precisely this question. We will look at what the Jewish tradition says about the nature of sin and forgiveness, trace how sacrifice was understood in the Torah itself, and discover why, from the standpoint of Judaism, The idea of a substitutionary sacrifice contradicts not only tradition, but the very text of Scripture. We will not seek to determine who is right. This is a historical investigation, not a theological trial. But the conclusions it leads to will prove quite unexpected. Let us begin at the very beginning, with what sacrifice actually was in ancient Judaism. If you want to understand why Jews do not accept the idea of Jesus' sacrifice, you must first understand what sacrifice is in the Jewish tradition itself, what it meant, what it was for, and how it worked. Because most people raised in Christian culture automatically transfer the Christian understanding of sacrifice onto the Jewish text, and this is where the first and most fundamental misunderstanding arises. The word for sacrifice in Hebrew is korban. This is a very important word, and its origin speaks for itself. The root of this word means to draw near, not ransom, not payment, not debt settlement, but precisely drawing closer to someone. Sacrifice in ancient Judaism was first and foremost an act of drawing near to God, a kind of symbolic language through which a person expressed their relationship to the Creator. A person came to God not empty-handed. They brought something valuable from their life, something that cost them labor and care. It was a gift, and this gift became a bridge between the human and the divine. The system of sacrifices in the Torah was extensive and multi-layered. There were thanksgiving offerings, when a person simply wanted to express gratitude to God for a bestowed good. There were vow offerings, when a person fulfilled a given word. There were peace offerings, burnt offerings, offerings of the first fruits of the harvest. Each type of sacrifice had its own meaning, its own ritual, its own sense. And yes, among them were sacrifices for sin. In Hebrew, they were called chatat and asham. But here begins what most often goes unnoticed. The sin offering in the Torah was never a universal mechanism of forgiveness, some magical tool that worked automatically as soon as the person brought an animal to the altar. It had very specific boundaries and very specific limitations. First, the sin offering was intended exclusively for unintentional violations of commandments. The Torah states this quite clearly. If a person sinned by mistake, through ignorance, due to circumstances, for such cases, atonement through sacrifice is provided. But if a person willfully violated a commandment, if they understood what they were doing and did it anyway, no animal, no ritual could help them. Intentional sin fell outside the bounds of what sacrifice could atone for. Second, and this is even more important, sacrifice never replaced a person's internal change. It could complement repentance, but could not replace it. To bring an animal to the altar without feeling sincere regret for what was done, and without intending to change, this was an empty ritual, devoid of meaning. The prophets spoke of this repeatedly and in very sharp terms, and it is precisely their voice that reaches us through the pages of the Tanakh with particular force. The prophet Micah asks on behalf of the people, "With what shall I come before the Lord? Perhaps with thousands of rams, with endless rivers of oil?" And answers himself, "You have been told, O man, what is good, and what the Lord requires of you, only to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God." No sacrifices are on this list. The prophet Isaiah conveys God's words with a directness that astonished listeners thousands of years ago and continues to astonish today. What need have I of the multitude of your sacrifices? Your burnt offerings are not pleasing to me. Your assemblies are a burden to me. Wash yourselves, make yourselves clean. Learn to do good, seek justice, correct oppression, defend the fatherless, plead for the widow. This is what matters. The prophet Hosea quotes words that would become the leitmotif of the entire prophetic tradition. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. These are not marginal statements by individual thinkers. This is the central line that runs through the entire Tanakh, and it speaks with astonishing clarity. Ritual without internal change is worthless. True forgiveness comes not through the altar, but through a change of heart. It is precisely from this tradition that grew what became Judaism's main instrument regarding the forgiveness of sins, the concept of teshuvah. The word teshuvah in Hebrew means return, not simply repentance in the everyday sense, not merely regret for a bad deed, but precisely a return to God, to the right path, to oneself. It is a dynamic process with specific steps, and the Jewish tradition developed them with great care over many centuries. The first step is acknowledgement. A person must honestly name what they have done, without making excuses or shifting responsibility onto circumstances or other people. This requires a certain internal honesty, which in itself is already a spiritual effort. The second step is sincere regret. Not formal, not dictated by fear of punishment, but genuine, understanding that by their action a person caused harm to another person, to their connection with God, to themselves. The third step is refraining from repetition. And it is this step, according to Jewish tradition, that is decisive. Regret without a change in behavior is not teshuvah. It is just words. True return always manifests in action. And the fourth step, which is especially important in cases where harm was caused to another person, restitution. To ask forgiveness from the one harmed, to make amends, to do what can be done to correct the consequences of one's action. A fundamentally important feature of this system is that it is completely self-contained. It requires no mediator. It requires no priest. It requires no altar. It is a direct connection between a person and God, accessible to everyone, anywhere, at any time. The Talmud, one of the most important compendiums of Jewish wisdom, formulated this in a simple and powerful formula. Teshuvah, prayer, and charity avert the evil decree. In this formula, there is not a word about sacrifice. It is precisely this system that became the spiritual foundation that allowed Judaism to survive the greatest catastrophe, the destruction of the temple. The year 70 CE, Jerusalem, after several years of exhausting rebellion against Rome, fell under the blows of legions commanded by Titus. The siege was long and brutal. The city resisted to the last, but the forces were unequal. The temple was burned. Thousands perished. Tens of thousands were taken into slavery or scattered across the expanse of the empire. From a religious point of view, this was a catastrophe difficult to overstate. The daily service, which had been performed without interruption for centuries, ceased. The altar fell silent. The priests, whose role in religious life seemed irreplaceable, were left without purpose. The physical center around which the entire religious life of the people was built disappeared. By all logic, Judaism should have either perished or undergone such radical changes as to become something fundamentally different. This is precisely what many observers of that time predicted. But this did not happen. And the reason lies in what we have already examined. The prophets over the centuries explain that the main thing is not the altar, but teshuvah. That God desires not the blood of animals, but a change of heart. That the path to forgiveness lies not through ritual, but through genuine return. When the temple collapsed, this teaching proved to be not a beautiful theory, but a practical guide for survival. Tradition preserves the image of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, one of the greatest sages of that time. According to tradition, when his student, looking at the smoking ruins of the temple, exclaimed in despair, "How will we atone for sins without sacrifices?" the teacher answered with the words of the prophet Hosea, "I desire mercy, not sacrifice." We have something no less than sacrifice, acts of love and kindness. This was not a cry of despair. It was a calm indication of what had long existed in the Jewish tradition. Nothing new was invented. Simply, what was once one component of religious life now became its entire content. And it is precisely at this historical moment when the two paths, the Jewish and the Christian, diverge definitively, that it is important to understand what Christianity offered as its answer to the very same problem. Christian theology, which developed over the first few centuries of the Common Era, offered an explanation of sin, forgiveness, and salvation built on entirely different foundations. Not on teshuvah, not on a direct connection between a person and God, but on the idea of a redemptive sacrifice, yet a sacrifice of a fundamentally different kind. At the heart of this theology lies the concept of original sin, the idea that the transgression of Adam and Eve damaged human nature itself, and this damage is inherited by all of humanity. A person is born already carrying this corruption within, and by their own strength cannot rid themselves of it, no matter how hard they try. The distance between a person and God is too great, the debt too enormous, and no human effort is capable of repaying it. To repay such a debt, according to this logic, a sacrifice of infinite value is needed, a sacrifice that would exceed the entire sum of human sins. Only God, having become human, could offer such a sacrifice. And this, from the perspective of Christian theology, is the meaning of the incarnation and the crucifixion of Jesus. It is not a tragedy or a defeat. It is the fulfillment of a plan conceived from the beginning of the world. The payment that God accepted himself so that humanity could be set free. The Apostle Paul, who more than anyone else formulated this concept in his epistles, asserted that without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness. This became one of the central tenets of Christian theology, and it is precisely here that the main divergence from Judaism is concentrated. Because from the perspective of the Jewish tradition, this assertion directly contradicts what is written in the Torah and the prophets. Let us return to the most important question of our investigation, but now look at it through the eyes of the Jewish tradition from within. We have already understood that Judaism has its own mechanism for forgiveness, teshuvah, and that it works without sacrifice. But now we must understand something more fundamental. Not simply whether a sacrifice is needed, but whether one person can die for the sins of others at all. Because it is precisely on this point that the Jewish and Christian traditions diverge most radically. In the Torah, in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 24, there is a verse considered in the Jewish tradition to be one of the key principles of justice and morality. Fathers shall not be put to death for children, and children shall not be put to death for fathers. Each shall be put to death for his own sin. This is the principle of individual responsibility, and it is formulated in the Torah with perfect clarity. Each person is responsible only for themselves. The prophet Ezekiel develops this idea in the 18th chapter of his book, one of the most important for understanding Jewish ethics. He says in plain text, "The soul that sins shall die. The son shall not bear the guilt of the father, and the father shall not bear the guilt of the son. The righteousness of the righteous shall be upon himself, and the wickedness of the wicked shall be upon himself." This is not an ambiguous metaphor or a poetic image. It is a theological statement about the nature of moral responsibility. It is precisely these texts that the Jewish tradition cites as a direct objection to the idea of a substitutionary sacrifice. A substitutionary sacrifice is a situation where one bears punishment instead of another, where another's death is counted against another's guilt. But the Torah says, this cannot be. Each is responsible for their own. There is another argument considered very significant in the Jewish tradition. If we recall the system of sacrifices in the Torah itself, the blood of an animal offered for sin worked precisely because it was the blood of an animal, not a human. The sacrifice of a human in the Torah was not merely not prescribed, it was directly forbidden and called an abomination. This was one of the main distinctions of the Israelite religion from the surrounding pagan cults, many of which practiced human sacrifice. The story of Abraham and Isaac, which the Jewish tradition calls the Akedah, the binding, is read in this very key. God tests Abraham's faith by demanding he sacrifice his son, but at the last moment stops him, replacing the human sacrifice with an animal sacrifice. The meaning of this story, in the Jewish reading, is precisely that human sacrifice is not what the God of Israel desires. This is a fundamental difference from everything that existed around it. Thus, from the perspective of Judaism, the idea of human sacrifice contradicts not merely tradition, it contradicts the very logic of the religious system it references. Another layer of this dispute is connected to the concept of original sin, upon which the Christian understanding of the need for a redemptive sacrifice is built. Because if there is no original sin, then the entire construct explaining the necessity of Jesus' sacrifice loses its foundation. Judaism does not accept the concept of original sin at all. And this is not simply a denial, it is a consequence of a fundamentally different view of human nature. In the Jewish tradition, a person is born with two inclinations, the Yetzer HaTov, the good inclination, and the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination. These concepts can also be translated differently. The constructive inclination and the destructive inclination, the altruistic and the selfish, the disciplined and the spontaneous. Both are an integral part of human nature. Both are given by God, and both are necessary for a full life. The Yetzer Hara in this system is not sin itself and not a corruption of nature. It is an energy that, when properly directed, becomes the engine of everything constructive in a person. Ambition, desires, the instinct for self-preservation, attraction, all these are manifestations of the Yetzer Hara, and the Talmud states quite unambiguously, were it not for this inclination, a person would not build a house, engage in trade, or start a family. The task of a person in the Jewish tradition is not the destruction of the evil inclination or salvation from a corrupted nature. but the management of both inclinations, directing them in the right way. This is a task that each person solves themselves in their own life, and precisely for this reason they bear personal responsibility for it. The transgression of Adam and Eve in the Jewish reading is not a catastrophe that damaged all of human nature forever. It is an event that determined the conditions of human existence, mortality, labor, the necessity to distinguish good from evil independently. Adam and Eve sinned and bear responsibility for their own. Their descendants come into the world with the same nature that Adam had before the transgression, capable of both good and evil, and bearing responsibility for their choice. This is precisely why, from the perspective of Judaism, no infinite debt pit from which humanity cannot extricate itself on its own exists. Each generation starts anew. Each person is not merely a link in a chain of transmitted guilt, but an independent moral personality, capable of making choices. And if there is no infinite debt, there is no need for an infinite sacrifice to repay it. A discussion about the sacrifice of Jesus is impossible without touching on the topic of the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur. Because it is on this day, considered the most significant in the religious year in Judaism, that how the Jewish tradition understands the forgiveness of sins is most fully revealed. Yom Kippur has existed since biblical times. During the Temple period, a special service was performed on this day. The high priest entered the Holy of Holies, the only place no one could enter at any other time, and performed an atonement rite for the entire people. Part of this ritual was the famous scapegoat, an animal upon whose head the high priest laid his hands, as if transferring the sins of the people onto it, after which the goat was sent away into the wilderness. It is precisely this image that became one of the prototypes Christian theology uses to explain the sacrifice of Jesus. He takes upon himself the sins of the people and departs, carrying them away with him. But let us look at how Yom Kippur functions in Judaism today, without the temple, without the high priest, without the scapegoat. In modern Judaism, this day is built entirely on personal teshuvah. 25 hours of fasting, prayers, confession, but not before a priest, but before God directly in one's own heart. The 10 days preceding Yom Kippur are called the Days of Awe, and during this time every Jew is called to sort out their relationships with people they have harmed, to ask for forgiveness, to correct what can be corrected. A fundamental point that the rabbinic tradition emphasizes with particular insistence: Yom Kippur atones for sins against God, but not sins against people. For that, one must first make peace with the person themselves. God does not forgive on behalf of another person. That person must forgive themselves. This is another manifestation of the same principle. Forgiveness is always a personal act, a personal encounter, which cannot be replaced by a ritual. This is precisely why one of the most beautiful customs of Yom Kippur developed in Judaism. On the eve of this day, people go to everyone they have quarreled with during the year and ask for forgiveness personally, looking them in the eye. No prayer in the synagogue can replace this conversation. Here it is worth considering how the Jewish tradition answers a question that seems natural from a Christian point of view. Is a person not weak? Are they capable by their own strength of dealing with sin? Do they not need help from above? Judaism does not deny that a person is weak. It does not claim that the path to righteousness is simple or that everyone easily fulfills their obligations, but it insists that God created a person with a real, not illusory, capacity for moral choice. If a person were fundamentally incapable of doing good, the demands of the Torah would be a cruel mockery, not a guide to life. In the Torah, in the book of Deuteronomy, there is a remarkable passage in which God says to the people, "The commandment I give you today is not hidden from you and is not far away. It is not in heaven and not beyond the sea. It is very close to you, in your mouth and in your heart, to do it." This is a direct assertion that the commandments are doable, that God does not set before a person tasks beyond their strength. It is precisely this optimistic view of human nature that is one of the deep foundations of why Judaism does not need salvation from outside. A person is not broken. They are weak and inconsistent, but not broken. And therefore they are capable of returning on their own. Now let us turn to how the Jewish tradition reads those very texts of the Tanakh that Christian theology uses as prophecies about the redemptive sacrifice of Jesus. Because this question is one of the most acute in this dispute, and it requires honest and careful consideration, the main text in question is the 53rd chapter of the book of the prophet Isaiah. This is one of the most famous passages in the entire Old Testament, and it describes a certain figure called the suffering servant. This servant is humiliated and despised by people. He bears illnesses and sorrows. He is pierced for the sins of others. His cruel suffering becomes healing for many people. The Christian tradition from the earliest times reads this text as a prophecy about Jesus, about his sufferings, death, and the redemptive meaning of that death. It is one of the most important supports for the New Testament understanding of Christ as the suffering Messiah. The Jewish tradition reads this text in a fundamentally different way. According to the most common rabbinic interpretation, the suffering servant in the 53rd chapter of Isaiah is the people of Israel themselves, personified in the image of a single person. A people who, throughout their history, suffered among other nations, were persecuted and humiliated, bore a burden disproportionate to their sins, and precisely through this suffering, ultimately, bore witness to God before all the nations of the world. This is not an arbitrary interpretation. It is supported by the context of the entire book of Isaiah, where the image of the servant of the Lord appears repeatedly and is clearly related to Israel as a people. In the 41st chapter, God directly calls Israel his servant. In the 44th, again. A reader familiar with the entire book naturally continues this image into the 53rd chapter. Furthermore, Jewish commentators point to grammatical and contextual features of this text, which, in their view, prevent it from being read as a description of a person sacrificed for the sins of others, in the sense understood by the Christian tradition. This dispute over interpretation has continued for nearly 2,000 years, and this is not the place to draw a final conclusion. What is important is different. Both interpretations exist, both have their own internal logic, and neither is obvious or the only possible one. This is a genuine dispute about the meaning of an ancient text, and precisely as such, it deserves respectful attention. Another important point of disagreement concerns the very nature of the Messiah, and this directly touches upon the question of sacrifice. In the Jewish tradition, the Messiah is not God become man, nor a being of supernatural nature. He is a man, great, outstanding, righteous, but a man. The Anointed One of God. This is precisely what the Hebrew word Mashiach means, and this is the meaning invested in it by tradition. The kings of Israel, Saul, David, Solomon, they were all anointed ones in this sense. The expected Messiah must be a descendant of David, and he must accomplish very specific tasks in this physical world. According to Jewish belief, The signs of the Messiah's coming are unambiguous and objectively verifiable. He must restore the sovereignty of Israel. He must gather all Jews from the diaspora and return them to their homeland. He must rebuild the temple, and, most importantly, he must bring the entire world to peace and to the knowledge of God, so that all wars cease and all nations recognize the unity of the Creator. It is precisely these criteria, from the perspective of Judaism, that Jesus did not fulfill. The world after his life and death did not become peaceful. The Jews did not return to Israel. On the contrary, 40 years after the crucifixion, Jerusalem was destroyed, and the diaspora only intensified. The temple was not rebuilt. Wars did not cease. The Christian tradition responds to this by pointing to the second coming. The final fulfillment of messianic prophecies will occur upon Jesus' return. But it is precisely this answer that, from the perspective of Judaism, constitutes a theological violation of the rules. Nowhere in the Tanakh is there mention of a Messiah who will come twice. A Messiah who did not accomplish his mission the first time, from a Jewish point of view, simply is not the Messiah, no matter how great his spiritual merits may be in other respects. And if Jesus is not the Messiah, then his death is not a messianic sacrifice. But here it is necessary to make one very important caveat, often omitted in this conversation. The Jewish tradition does not deny that Jesus was a real historical person. It does not deny that he was a teacher who made a tremendous impression on his contemporaries. It does not even deny that in some of his teachings he relied on values familiar to Judaism: love for one's neighbor, care for the poor, striving for justice. What is rejected is the specific theological construct that he was God incarnate, that his death was an atoning sacrifice for the sins of all humanity, and that acceptance of this idea is necessary for the forgiveness of sins. It is precisely these assertions, from the perspective of Judaism, that contradict what the Torah and the prophets say about the nature of God and the mechanism of forgiveness. Judaism is strictly monotheistic, and this is not merely a theological thesis. It is the very core of Jewish religious identity. The Shema Yisrael, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, is a prayer a Jew recites twice daily, words he must repeat in his final moment of life. The idea that God became a man, or that there is any plurality within God himself, is perceived in Judaism as a violation of this central principle. This is why a characteristic formulation is found in medieval Jewish sources. Acceptance of the teaching about Jesus as God and Messiah would mean for a Jew not simply a change of religion, but a renunciation of the very core of what he believes. This is not merely cultural inertia or a simple reluctance to change habits. It is theological consistency. If God is one and indivisible, then he could not become incarnate in a man. If he did not become incarnate, then Jesus is a man, not God. If he is a man, then his death cannot have the infinite redemptive significance ascribed to it in Christian theology. And yet, the history of this dispute is not reducible only to theological arguments. For many centuries, relations between Jews and Christians were overshadowed not only by theological disagreements, but also by real historical events, which could not but influence how Jews perceived Christianity itself. The Crusades, during which Jewish communities in Europe were subjected to mass pogroms, forced conversions to Christianity. The Inquisition, centuries-old accusations of ritual murder, having no basis in reality, but leading to bloody pogroms. The expulsion from Spain in 1492, one of the greatest tragedies of the Jewish people. The forced baptism of children, the separation of families, the destruction of Jewish books. All this occurred in societies that considered themselves Christian, and all this inevitably shaped the attitude of Jews towards the symbolism and teachings in whose name these events were carried out. For many generations of Jews, the cross was not a symbol of salvation, but a symbol of persecution. And this historical dimension cannot simply be erased from the conversation. This does not mean that the theological dispute can be reduced to historical grievances. But it does mean that behind the cold theological arguments, there always stands a living human history, and understanding this makes the conversation more honest. It is important to consider another aspect which rarely comes to the center of this conversation, but is perhaps one of the most important for understanding the Jewish position. This concerns how Judaism answers the question about the fate of people who lived before the birth of Jesus. This question seems simple, but it reveals a very deep theological contradiction. If the sacrifice of Jesus is the sole or primary path to forgiveness and salvation, then what happens to the people who lived before his birth? What happens to Abraham, to Moses, to David, to the thousands upon thousands of righteous people who lived over thousands of years before the first century CE? They could not possibly have availed themselves of a sacrifice that did not yet exist. Were they condemned? Were they saved as some kind of exception? And if as an exception, then the sacrifice is not absolutely necessary, since it was possible to be saved without it after all. Christian theology has offered various answers to this question depending on the specific tradition and historical period. Some theologians spoke of a special state in which the righteous of the Old Testament awaited their liberation through Christ's sacrifice. Others asserted that the Old Testament righteous were saved by faith in the coming Messiah, a kind of preliminary, anticipatory faith in what had not yet happened. But one way or another, all these answers acknowledge, before the coming of Jesus, there existed some other path. For the Jewish tradition, this argument is one of the most convincing. If Abraham, Moses, and all the prophets received forgiveness and righteousness without the sacrifice of Jesus, then such a path exists. It means that teshuvah always worked. It means that God was always ready to accept a person who turned to him directly, without an intermediary, without blood, without the death of another being as payment. Judaism sees no problem here, because it never asserted that a sacrifice was needed for forgiveness. The problem arises precisely within that system which insists on the absolute necessity of a sacrifice, and then is forced to acknowledge that for many generations, salvation was nevertheless available without it. There is another area that cannot be bypassed in this conversation. This is the question of the nature of God, of what he is and what he cannot be by his very definition. Because the rift between the Jewish and Christian understanding of God is not simply a disagreement over one of the theological points. It is a disagreement about the very foundation, about the nature of the one to whom prayers are offered and in whom faith is placed. In Judaism, God is absolutely and unconditionally one. This means not only one, not three, in a numerical sense. It means something significantly deeper. God in Judaism has no physical incarnation, no bodily image, no human face in a literal sense. He is not born and does not die. He cannot become a man, because to become something means to undergo change, and God, by definition, is unchanging. He cannot suffer in a physical sense because physical suffering is a property of a body, and God is incorporeal. This is not a cold philosophical abstraction. It is a living religious conviction that the Jewish people have preserved with such tenacity that throughout history they were prepared to pay the highest price for it. Throughout biblical history, the primary sin that the prophets condemned again and again was idolatry, the worship of something visible, tangible, having an image. The struggle against idolatry is not merely religious polemics. It is the defense of the very center of Jewish faith, the absolute, incomprehensible, unincarnated unity of the Creator. This is precisely why the idea that God became incarnate in a man, that he was born, lived, suffered, and died a physical death, this, for the Jewish religious consciousness, is not merely a theological error. It is a violation of the very principle for the preservation of which this entire long journey was undertaken. To accept this idea would mean, from the perspective of Judaism, to negate everything for which the prophets stood and for which martyrs gave their lives. It is precisely in this context that the position of medieval Judaism should be considered, because it was in the Middle Ages that the dispute between the two traditions reached its most acute intellectual form. One of the greatest Jewish philosophers and theologians of that era was Maimonides, whom the Jewish tradition calls the Rambam. He lived in the 12th century in Spain and Egypt, and left behind works that to this day remain among the most important in Jewish thought. In his systematic work on Jewish law and philosophy, he formulated 13 principles of faith, which became a kind of creed of Judaism. Among these principles are the absolute unity of God, his incorporeality, his eternity, the conviction that no prophet received a revelation greater than that of Moses, and that the Torah is unchanging and will not be replaced by another law. Each of these principles is a direct theological objection to specific tenets of Christian doctrine, and Maimonides formulated them not in academic silence, but in the real world, where Jews were surrounded by a majority demanding acceptance of another faith. In those same medieval centuries, something occurred that must be mentioned within our investigation. Across Europe, from the Rhine to the Vistula, Jewish communities lived among a Christian majority, and it was then, in these centuries, that the relations between the two traditions acquired that historical residue felt to this day. Forced public disputations were organized by the authorities with a predetermined outcome. Any result could lead to a pogrom. Jews were forced to listen to compulsory sermons in synagogues. Children were baptized secretly from their parents. The Inquisition persecuted those who had been baptized outwardly, but continued secretly to observe Jewish traditions. Thousands of people found themselves between two worlds, deprived of the possibility either to openly profess their faith or to fully integrate into the new life. In the year 1492, the Spanish crown ordered all Jews of Spain to either accept baptism or leave the country within a few months. This was one of the largest Jewish communal centers in the world. People whose ancestors had lived on the Iberian Peninsula for over 1,000 years were forced to leave everything behind and go into the unknown. Hundreds of thousands of people scattered across the Mediterranean, Turkey, North Africa, and the Netherlands. This event remains in Jewish memory as one of the greatest tragedies since the destruction of the Temple. All of this occurred under the banner of the same teaching of atonement and salvation, in whose name missionary work, coercion, and persecution were justified. It would be unjust to reduce the entire history of Christianity to its darkest pages. Throughout those same centuries, there were Christians who defended Jews, gave them shelter, and condemned violence. But the systemic reality was such that the very structure of the relationship created centuries of pressure that cannot be ignored in an honest historical analysis. In the 20th century, relations between Judaism and Christianity underwent significant changes. The Second Vatican Council in 65 adopted a document that absolved Jews of the charge of deicide, a charge that for nearly 2,000 years had served as justification for anti-Jewish persecution. Many Christian churches revised their attitude toward the Jewish people and their religion. A serious interreligious dialogue began, not with the aim of converting one another, but with the aim of understanding. This dialogue continues today, and within its framework, more and more theologians from both sides recognize that the question is not who is right and who is wrong, but that each tradition sees something of its own in the very same texts, and this something of its own is inseparable from the entire history, culture, and spiritual experience of each of them. But let us return to the very essence of our question, because it is here, at the very end of our investigation, that several important observations need to be made. So, why is the sacrifice of Jesus not needed by Jews? Not needed, not in the sense of we reject it out of stubbornness, but in the sense of it does not fit into the system of coordinates that the Torah and the prophets built over millennia. First observation: Judaism never taught that blood is the sole or primary path to forgiveness. The Torah provided such an opportunity through sacrifice, but the prophets throughout biblical history consistently explained that this is not the most important thing. The most important thing is teshuvah, and when the temple was destroyed, Judaism lost nothing essential to its theology of forgiveness, because the main thing was always elsewhere. Second observation: the principle of individual responsibility, established in the Torah and developed by the prophets, excludes the very possibility that one person can bear punishment for the sins of others. This is not a Christian distortion of the Jewish text. It is a direct contradiction to what is written in it. Third observation: the concept of original sin, which is the necessary foundation for understanding the sacrifice of Jesus as necessary and sufficient, is absent in Judaism. A person in the Jewish tradition is not born damaged and does not need salvation from a corrupted nature. They need guidance, upbringing, and their own efforts to direct their nature toward good. Fourth observation: the criteria for messiahship, developed in the Jewish tradition based on the Tanakh, are concrete and objective. The Messiah must change the world, really, visibly, verifiably. From this perspective, the debate about whether Jesus is the Messiah can be concluded by simply pointing to the facts of history. The world after him did not become what it should become after the arrival of the Messiah. This does not mean that Christianity is wrong within its own system of coordinates. Christianity created a holistic and profound theological system that for 2 millennia has given meaning, comfort, and spiritual support to billions of people. Arguing with this significance is pointless. But from the perspective of the Jewish tradition, this system was built on top of Jewish texts, not from within them. It uses the same books, the same prophets, the same imagery, but arrives at conclusions that from a Jewish point of view are not supported by these texts. And precisely for this reason, not out of stubbornness, not out of blindness, not out of a refusal to acknowledge the obvious, the Jewish tradition continues to insist forgiveness is available to every person directly, without intermediaries, without sacrifice, without blood. Through honest acknowledgement of one's actions, through sincere regret, through real change, through teshuvah. This is not a modest answer to a great question. It is an answer that Judaism has defended for millennia, including the most difficult times of its history. And it is precisely this conviction that became one of the main sources of resilience with which the Jewish people endured what they endured. The story we have examined today is not just a theological dispute. It is a story of how two peoples, reading the same words, saw two different worlds in them. How one tradition diverged onto two paths and walked them for thousands of years, each in its own way, carrying its own light and its own pain. But before we conclude this investigation, it is worth pausing on another important question. We have spoken about why the sacrifice of Jesus is not needed by Jews from a theological point of view. But there is another angle. What does Judaism offer in return? Not just the absence of sacrifice, but what exactly, as a positive answer to the question of the meaning of life, of guilt, and of atonement. Judaism's answer to this question is deeper than simply do good deeds. It is a holistic system of meanings in which human life is understood as a space for choice and history as a path that has direction and purpose. At the center of this system are the commandments. In Hebrew, they are called mitzvot, and according to tradition, there are 613 of them. The word mitzvah itself in everyday speech is often translated as a good deed. To do a mitzvah means to do a good deed. But in a theological sense, a mitzvah is a commandment, that is, an obligation accepted within the covenant between God and the people of Israel. The Jewish tradition views these commandments not as a heavy burden, though observing them requires real effort, but as a tool with which a person builds their life in accordance with the Creator's design. Each commandment, from the most solemn to the most mundane, is a point of contact between the human world and the world of God. Putting on tefillin in the morning, helping someone in need, observing the Sabbath, reciting a blessing before eating, all of these are not formalities, but living threads connecting a person to the source of meaning. And it is within this system that teshuvah takes its place, not as an emergency exit, but as a built-in mechanism. A person is imperfect, that is a given. They violate commandments, make mistakes, cause pain to others and to themselves. Teshuvah is not an extraordinary measure, but a normal, constant part of spiritual life. Every year, every month, every day, a person has the opportunity to return, and this opportunity is not limited by the number of attempts or the severity of past mistakes. The Talmudic tradition preserves a striking statement, the meaning of which is hard to overestimate. Where a person who has done teshuvah stands, even a completely righteous person cannot stand. This is not just consolation for sinners, it is a theological assertion that the path of return reveals something in a person that cannot be achieved otherwise. One who has fallen and gotten up knows something that one who has never fallen does not know. In this logic, sin is not a stigma or a debt that must be paid off with someone else's blood. Sin is a deviation from the path, which indicates the need for correction. God in Judaism is not a prosecutor demanding payment of a debt, nor a judge who needs to be appeased with a sacrifice. He is a father awaiting the return of a child. And when the child returns, no other payment is required. It is this idea that resonates in one of the most important prayers of Yom Kippur, which Jews recite again and again throughout the day of fasting. You extend your hand to sinners, and your right hand is open to receive the repentant. not sacrifice, not an intermediary, not blood, an extended hand. This is an image of a relationship, not a transaction. Looking at all this from a historical distance, it is impossible not to notice one striking fact. Judaism and Christianity began their journey from the same point, from the same texts, the same traditions, the same history. The first Christians were Jews who read the same Torah scrolls and the same books of the prophets as their neighbors who did not accept the new teaching. The split did not happen immediately or in one day. It grew gradually, through disputes, separations, and tragic historical events. And yet it is astonishing how differently these two worlds read the same texts. Where Christianity saw a prophecy of a suffering Messiah, Judaism saw an image of a suffering people. Where Christianity saw the necessity of a redemptive sacrifice, Judaism saw the primacy of teshuvah and a direct connection with God. Where Christianity saw a new Adam correcting the sin of the first, Judaism saw a person, initially capable of good and bearing responsibility for their choices. This is not a dispute about minor details. This is a dispute about the deepest questions that can concern a person. Who am I? What is the meaning of my mistakes? How do I return to what I should be? And who or what stands between me and the source of meaning? Judaism answers, there is no intermediary between you and God. You yourself, your repentance, your actions, your desire to return, that is what matters. This is an answer, simple in form and infinitely demanding in content. It does not offer ready-made atonement. It offers a path that one must walk oneself. That is why the story we have examined today is not only a story of a theological dispute. It is a story of two different understandings of what it means to be a human being before God. And in this sense, it concerns every one of us, regardless of which tradition we belong to, or whether we belong to any tradition at all. To understand this difference is to understand something very important about how people seek God, how they make sense of guilt and forgiveness, how they build a bridge between their own imperfection and what they would like to be. And this theme, as you can see, does not lose its depth and its human poignancy, no matter how many centuries have passed since the first words of this ancient dispute were spoken.